My name is Courtney Burr, and my presentation is it's called Death by Critical CVE, Escaping the Flood of Score-Based Remediation. You'll notice that there's another person on this slide. His name is Andrew Nelson. He's not here. They only let us have one presenter here, but he is also a co-author. Want to make sure that he gets credit for that. So for a quick agenda, I'm going to do an introduction. Should be really quick. I'm going to explain some of the problems with CVSS-based or score-based remediations. And then we're going to go through some real-world misprioritizations. We're going to talk about enhancing prioritization with context-based signals, and then some integration ideas, and then finally just doing a real quick conclusion at the very end. All right, who am I? Why do you care what I'm about to say? 2 years I've been at Qualys as a Senior Security Solutions Architect, which is just a fancy title for sales engineer. Prior to that, I was at Microsoft for 6 years, between Azure's Threat and Vulnerability Management team, and also Xbox's Threat and Vulnerability Management team. I am also a perpetual volunteer. I'm a co-organizer for the volunteers at Seattle B-Sides. I volunteer at places like the Diana Initiative. I'm also DEF CON SOC volunteer, the make a whole kind, not the free hugs kind, and a bunch of other places. And then I am also a veteran, I guess. So some takeaways for this. Want to focus on CVSS alone is not sufficient for risk-based prioritization. And context is everything. Context changes the priority, right? So the same vulnerability can be critical or it could be low depending on the environment that the asset is located within. Threat intelligence helps focus on what attackers are actually exploiting, so you're focusing and doing your remediation efforts on what actually matters. And then lastly, we need to measure risk to business, not just counting vulnerabilities, so organizations can invest their limited resources in what actually matters to reduce the overall risk. Now, as some foundational knowledge, right? CVE, also known as Common Vulnerability and Exposure, it's a unique identifier for publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. And another one, CVSS, you'll hear me say both of those a lot. Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's a free or open standard for assessing the severity of a vulnerability, or the CVE. It's a numerical score that's assigned 0 to 10, right, where 9 to 10 is critical, 7 to 8.9 is high, 4.0 to 6.9 is medium, and then below that is low. For the scope of this, we're going to focus on 3.1, CVSS version 3.1, because that's the version that we see most commonly in use right now. There are 3 metrics for all the scoring factors: base, temporal, and environmental. The base score is always static. It will never change for the CVE regardless of the threat landscape. It describes the exploitability and impact to a system should that vulnerability be actually exploited. Temporal is dynamic, and it describes the things like the exploit or remediation levels. So as exploits mature or as remediation levels increase, whether there's a fix available, full patch, or just a mitigation, that temporal score will dynamically change. The last one, environmental, this is the most important for your risk, right? And it's almost also never used. Probably less than 5% of people that I've talked to or organizations that I've worked with actually use temporal or environmental. But the environmental is where you add in your business context to customize the score. You can modify the base metrics, such as if the attack vector for the vulnerability is network, but the asset you are assessing is in a segmented network or internal only, you can adjust the network score, you can adjust the CVSS score down once you incorporate the environmental metrics. So I have one example, CVE 2017-5715. It says that it's a medium CVSS score, but again, the risk actually varies dramatically based on the environment, right? We're seeing a base score of 5.6 and a temporal of 5.2. Quick question, does anybody recognize that CVE? What is it? Nobody?
No.
It's a CVE for Spectre, from Spectre Meltdown from a few years ago, 2017. Just as a side note. Okay. So what happens when we rely only on CVSS scores, so the score-based prioritization? These are some real-world use cases that I've actually experienced in my career. The first one, It's the way that they were prioritizing their patching was confirmed vulnerabilities with CVSS of 6 or higher and a vendor severity of 4 to 5. That means that they're relying on a lot of the intel from the vendor. That's where the confirmed and the 4 to 5 comes in. And the result was, at this organization, because they were a very large organization, more vulnerabilities per month to be fixed than a lot of companies have in actual annual revenue. Use case number 2 is they prioritized CVSS 8 and higher, or vendor severity 4 and 5, or their self-described critical vulnerabilities. And this results in a significant amount of overhead, right? So they're prioritizing so many vulnerabilities that, there are a lot of severity 4 vulnerabilities that don't have a CVSS score of 8 or higher, right? So the result is a significant amount of overhead, and can result in things like burnout and higher costs, right? But they're still prioritizing the wrong vulnerability. And the last one, only OS level patches. And that's real. Like, they legitimately only were patching OS level security patches. So they were missing, their database patches, their middleware patches, like Chrome's browser, the browser updates and everything like that. And the only thing I could do is kind of laugh at the result, right? Because there's missing so many vulnerabilities. There's so many patches to fix. Yeah. Now, let me show you an example of where some of these prioritizations go wrong. Right. So here's 2 real-world misprioritization examples. The first one is called Bleeding Tooth. That is a 0-click RCE in the Linux Bluetooth stack. It sounds terrifying, but the reality is that the person actually has to be within physical distance of the device. Bluetooth has to be enabled and in discoverable mode in order for it to be actually patched, right, or to be effective. So even though it has a CVSS score of 8.3, the actual risk to this vulnerability is significantly lower, especially in data centers and Linux server environments. On the other side, there's the low CVSS with a high risk, right? 2024-50302 has a CVSS of 5, but it's actually known, it's part of the CSICEV, so known exploitable vulnerabilities list. And was actually paired with some Android exploits and used by law enforcement to unlock some confiscated phones. The key thing that I want to focus on here is that only 2% of vulnerabilities, or 2% of CVEs, are ever going to be exploited, but CVSS can't tell you which 2%, right? And that's kind of the problem. It measures technical severity, not the business risk or the actual threat. To provide a little bit more context, 2024, we really were in a boon for CVEs, and it's continuing to grow year over year, right? Every year we're getting more CVEs, more vulnerabilities being disclosed. 2024, based on the data that we were able to gather, which the data for CVEs is a little interesting because there was a huge backlog, so it's kind of tough to figure out where the numbers actually are. But this is as accurate as we could find. 28,000 CVEs, more than 28,000 CVEs in 2024, which averages 79 per day, right? Roughly 31% were rated critical. So that's almost 9,000 CVEs that are critical. So if you're only doing 9.0, critical CVSS, you're still patching or targeting almost 9,000 vulnerabilities, which is pretty significant. If we're doing the math and we go back to the 2%, that's about 560 CVEs that will actually have an exploit created and actually pose a material risk to your organization, right? So potentially 98% of your effort is spent on vulnerabilities that won't pose a risk. Another thing to note is that it averages 72 hours from disclosure to when a vulnerability starts to be weaponized and an exploit is developed for that. But we don't know which one, right? CVSS can't tell us which 2% is going to be actually exploited or developed for exploit. And the cost of this approach, try to show it here, right? You get a false sense of security. If you're saying that, I patched all my 9.0s, you're still missing some of the risk that's actually there. that result in increased risk of a security event, business disruption, wasted resources, burnout, things like that, right? According to Ponemon in 2024, it cost about $397 per patch to deploy. And if you're just focusing on the critical CVEs, that's $3.5 million, right? Because a lot of organizations care about the bottom line and what is the actual financial impact versus kind of anything else. Then again, 98% of patches were not going to actually be exploited. And then just as a side note, also 67% of security teams report burnout. So it's real, right? We're getting flooded with CVEs and we're not prioritizing what actually matters. We're not prioritizing the risk. We're just looking at the numbers. So what can you do? Right. Number one, you probably pay for a product that does a risk-based prioritization. So Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7, CrowdStrike, Kenna Security. If you're using one of those products within your organization, you should start having those discussions to understand how they're doing their risk-based prioritizations, and then try and shift to that if you're still using a score-based, CVSS 3.1. If you're not able to do that, or you're not using some of those products, the first thing that you should do is shift to 4.0. It's the latest and greatest. It has additional metrics, right? It has additional fields that you can still get a better picture of the risk, but it's still not enough because it's still missing some of the threat intel. So there are three things that I'm proposing that you should be incorporating. One of them is business context. One of them is EPSS score, and then also the CISA KEV, right? So let's understand the business context a little bit. So in this slide, on the left side, there is business context factors that should be taken into consideration when you're evaluating this. And then also on the right side, just a quick description of the different stages where the assets could reside, because that factors into the risk as well. So asset value, right? What does it cost a company if the system goes down? Is it part of a website that generates $100 million in revenue, or is it part of an internal portal that's used by one team? Right? Data sensitivity. Do you have any sort of regulatory requirements? Are you in scope for PCI, or is that asset in scope for PCI? Does it handle PII or PHI? Right? What is the attack surface? Is it a production level, externally facing web server, or is it internal behind, in a segmented network or behind firewalls, right? Also, what other compensating controls? So things that also reduce the likelihood of an exploit. And then the last thing to just keep in mind as well is the maintenance window, right? When can you take the machine offline and update the patches? Because you can't just patch your Windows server whenever you want to, right? So EPSS score, I've said that a lot. I haven't explained what it is. It's exploit prediction scoring system. So it's a machine learning model trained on real data to produce the probability score of the likelihood that an exploit is going to be developed in 30 days. It's maintained by FIRST, which is the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, and it is completely free. And I love that it's completely free. So why does it matter? Because it tells you how bad CVSS tells you how bad a vulnerability can be, while EPSS tells you how likely it is that vulnerability will be exploited in the next 30 days in the wild. So there are some critical combinations to think about as well, right? If you have a high CVSS and a low EPSS, kind of like the bleeding tooth example that I had earlier, it sounds scary, but the actual risk is most likely much lower, right? You can also have the low CVSS with a high EPSS. It seems minor, but because it has a higher EPSS, it's more likely to be exploited. So you should probably put some attention towards that. And then you have the high CVSS and high EPSS, and that should be more of your top priority, because it's the actual impact to a successfully exploited vulnerability is high, and there's a high likelihood that there's going to be an exploit developed. So two examples. One of them is a new CVSS or new CVE 2025-9478 has a CVSS score of 8.8 and an EPSS of 0.1%. The other one is from 2023, has a CVSS of 5.9, but it has an EPSS score of 64%. So what do you think should be of these two, what should be a higher priority to look at and potentially remediate? It should be the older one, right? But even if you add in EPSS and business context, that's still not enough. You should add in threat intelligence, right? So the first two that you should really start looking at would be the CISA-KEV, so the non-exploitable vulnerabilities list, especially if you have specific regulatory requirements or you do business with the government, right? The other one we just talked about, EPSS score, because it tells you, like I said, how likely it is for an exploit to be developed in the next 30 days. Once you get those, then you can start adding in additional feeds, like vendor advisories, your Patch Tuesday details, your Red Hat erratas, your Cisco advisories, things like that. And then additional threat feeds, right? So two of them that I'll mention is MIST Malware Information Sharing Platform and then Alien Vault OTX. But there's a plethora of different threat intelligence feeds, including a lot that are free that you can access via API. Once you do that, then you should add in additional security research and potentially with paid intel platforms to further supplement and enhance your prioritization process, right? So the important thing here that I think is integrate with the CISA-KEV and EPSS first, because those are going to be easier, and those are both completely free. So let's say in this scenario, you have your business context, you have CISA-KEV, and you have your EPSS score. So I want to give you a decision framework to kind of just think about how you want to prioritize the patching. And what I did on the right side under FedRAMP, their patching guidelines or requirements are a little different than what you should actually follow, right? That's going to be similar to, if you have insurance requirements or other regulatory requirements, you want to, if you can, you want to patch sooner and faster than what they say, right? So this is a real quick decision flow, right? Is it on the CISA-KEV? That'd be a good place to start, right? If it's yes, start patching or start to plan to patch. If it's not, does it also have a high EPSS or a high CVSS, right? Then that would be the next thing to patch. And then you just work through your environment or work through your assets from there, including, number 3, where it has more of the network environment context. So is it, production, or is it non-prod, or is it, a QA or dev? And then also other compensating controls. So your patching timelines are going to be unique to your organization. So that's just like the best case scenario that we wanted to put up there. You want to work with your leadership and find out exactly what their requirements are. But of course, the sooner or the faster that you can patch, the less likely it is to be exploited. I mentioned this earlier. It's about 72 hours before a exploit starts to get weaponized. In 2021 and 2022, it was about 32 days before the average time to exploit on average. In 2023, it was 5 days. And in 2024, while the average was about 72 hours, there actually was the first time that there was a -1 time to exploit. So somebody was exploiting the patch before it was actually publicly available. So the sooner you can patch and patch the things that matter, the lower risk your organization is going to have. So to bring this all together, we wanted to create a prototype automation example. What it does, it incorporates all of the different factors and all the different feeds, right? So CVSS score, EPSS score, asset context, CISA-KEV, and then also some temporal factors, specifically the age of the vulnerability. In the bottom left, you can see that it's a customizable scoring weight, so you can adjust it as you want to. And what it does is it pulls in vulnerability data from your scanner, so your Qualys, Nessus, Tenable, or also just a CSV. It'll normalize the data, it'll enrich it with EPSS, and cross-reference the CISA-KEV catalog, which is, of course, free. And then it'll add the asset context, from either CMDB or manual classification, and then it spits out a composite risk score between 0 to 100. The last thing it'll do, it also does a prioritized rank. So you can see in this example, it's ranked number 2. That's because number 1 had like 50 different affected assets, and it just didn't fit in the screenshot. So the first part of it, it's a Python script that outputs a JSON, and we want to take it a little bit further. So we also created just a prototype UI where you can actually go through and see what a prioritized list looks like, right? So you can click on the widgets to showcase the data that's there. You can click between the assets and CVEs. If you click on the CVE, it'll actually pull up the NIST CVE data. Yeah, so it's all customizable, and this is all just in that GitHub repo that I mentioned. There will be links at the end as well. Just some key metrics to be aware of. You don't want to over automate before you validate. So even if you want to take a look at this and use it as kind of a basis, just iterate through it, right? Normal development processes. Don't over automate. Just check it as you go. You want to also tune in the scoring to your specific environment because it will be different. And then also don't forget asset criticality. That's one of the key factors that you absolutely need to have. And then the last thing that we didn't account for, and just because this is a prototype, is exception handling, right? There's always going to be a reason for exceptions. You have to have this application at this specific level because of XYZ business reasons. So being able to document that and record that is also important. So, I don't know why I turned my camera on right there. That's weird. Technology. So to review this, CVSS alone doesn't reflect risk, right? It's a severity score, not a risk score. It's missing a lot of context, your threat intelligence, your asset criticality, your exploitability. Again, 2% of CVEs are actually exploited. So you want to make sure that you're focusing your efforts on those 2%. Context changes everything. It changes priority. So the same vulnerability in different environments will have a different risk score, right? If it's internal facing versus external facing, internet facing, it'll have a different urgency as well. And asset criticality drives business impact. Threat signals can guide your remediation efforts, CSAC, VPSS, vendor advisories, community threat feeds. There are so many free and open source feeds available that can help guide your remediation efforts. And then lastly, measure risk, not vulnerabilities, right? So you only have a limited amount of resources or funding to fix your vulnerabilities. So focus on what actually matters. Focus on the risk instead of just a vulnerability count. And that's the end of it. Let me see. Do I have one more? Oh, here are the sources, right? Some of the sources that we used for some of the research that we did. If anyone has any questions or anything, I'll be around all day. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah. Thank you.